Welcome to Growing a B2B SaaS. On this show, you'll get actionable and usable advice. You'll hear about all aspects of growing a business to a business software company. Customer success, sales, funding, bootstrapping, exits, scaling, everything you need to know about growing a startup, and you'll get it from someone who's going through the same journey. Now your host, Joran Hoffman.
Welcome back to another episode on the Grow Your B2B SaaS podcast. We discuss all topics on how to grow your B2B SaaS. With the rise of no-code tools and AI, some markets will be really crowded, as it's easier than ever to start your own SaaS. Today we're going to talk about that, how to win in a crowded B2B SaaS market. We're going to do this with Alan Gleeson. He's the founder of Contento. He's definitely practicing what he preaches. Contento is a headless CMS built for marketing sites, which is, of course, a highly competitive market. Before starting Contento, Alan worked in almost 50 B2B SaaS companies where most of them were VC-backed, which gives a really great perspective as they were in different industries, stages, and even countries. Nearly all of them were in a crowded B2B SaaS market, which makes him the perfect person to talk about this topic. Welcome to the show, Alan.
Thank you so much for having me on. Looking forward to talking through it with you.
Likewise. So I always do an intro. I always like to ask this question as well. Why should people listen to you today?
I guess one of the reasons, there's a few gray hairs for those who see it on video will see, but I've been involved with B2B SaaS since the internet was fast enough to actually render software over the browser. So I started my career shipping software into retail stores. So I think that gives me a bit of longevity in the space. But secondly, which you alluded to earlier, having been a consultant to approximately 50 B2B SaaS companies spanning the US, UK, Europe, and Ireland, I've had an opportunity to work with a big number of VC-backed, predominantly B2B SaaS companies at different stages of growth in different countries. So I've been fortunate to work with some great companies and have picked up lessons along the way that I think helps inform my view of the world.
Exactly. You've been looking into many kitchens, as we say in Dutch, seeing how other companies do it.
Well, from my perspective, yeah, it's looking at Google Analytics, right? That's typically the window in the world where you look at the data, right? So lots of Google Analytics from different companies over the years to help understand the drivers of growth.
Exactly. Let's start with a really maybe basic question, but also an important question. Why would you even have to consider starting a SaaS in a crowded market?
Yeah, so look, SaaS is a very attractive industry sector, where it's very exciting. There's been a lot of growth in SaaS in recent years, driven by a whole host of reasons. Remote working being one, the cost of starting up has decreased as well, and obviously a very attractive unit economics if you get SaaS right. The flip side is there's huge numbers of companies that are deciding, hey, let's do a startup. You come across two scenarios that are quite common. Your startup is very niche and obscure, and you look in Google search volumes and you can't find that many people searching for it. Or you're in a category that already exists, in which there is lots of competition, in which case you then have to craft a strategy to say, okay, competition can actually be good because it validates that there's a market for what we want to offer. And then you've got to look at how do you then craft a winning strategy in that context. So from my own perspective, we at Contento offer what's called a content management system. So a CMS, which essentially is what you use to power your website. WordPress is the dominant player in the market and has been there for over 20 years. But there are hundreds of others, if not thousands of CMSs. So therefore, again, building a startup in this space isn't very competitive means I've had to come up with a plan that gives us a fighting chance of success.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to talk about the plan. And I think you mentioned it right. If there's competition, it's good because there's a market, and like having a strategy to win is definitely important. But before you even, I guess, like start with the strategy, or maybe the strategy is a place to start, but what, in your opinion, should be in place when going into a competitive market?
The first thing is you've got to know the basic feature set, right? So there's this concept of table stake features. And by that, I mean, you got to have the features that the market expects you'd have. Now, the kind of quick way to do that is you go to something like G2 or Capterra, and you look in the category and you look at the naming of the category and the participants, and you'll see the features listed. So you definitely you don't want to be going in aggressive on marketing if you haven't really got the table stakes features in place, right? So that's a big gotcha. Secondly, you want this concept of product market fit ideally. So you do want to have this kind of period of initial build and initial marketing is very much you being the receiver of research, right? So you're treating it almost as a research project till you get to the point where you validated certain assumptions you made and are then happy to start looking at commercializing, because that will often entail people and money and cost, and you don't want to do that prematurely.
Yeah, that's really nice. I think the G2 is a really simple one, but really effective one and really important one. So you can steal a lot of ideas or a lot of things people need or they like, they don't like from the reviews they leave, basically.
Well, exactly. Or you go to the pricing pages of the competitors that you think are broadly in the category and you look at the features that they list out and then you make a call. Which are the kind of the features that you believe are core and drive a lot of value? Which are these features that they've added in over their 10 or 15 years of their kind of life cycle, which you think actually they're not really that valuable for the cohort that I want to target. So you don't need to worry about those, but you're being really tight on the kind of core basics that you would require. And you could look at search engine marketing industry as an example, right? There's a couple of big players like Ahrefs and SEMrush, and they've got hundreds and thousands of phenomenal features, which are really great for enterprise level SaaS. But if you're looking to enter that market, you could really cut down and introduce a product with much tighter feature set at a much lower price point that might meet the needs of earlier stage startups like your one and like mine.
Exactly. And there it all comes down to your ideal customer profile. I think in every podcast so far it has been mentioned, know who you're selling to, and then from there you can actually build a product, of course, they want.
That's actually a key point, right? So there's this notion of buyer personas are ideal customer profiles, and there can be multiple ones, and they can have different needs and requirements. But the more you know about those, the better then you can have an effective strategy. From our perspective, the people that we know is the technology person will invariably be involved in a website decision. The marketing person may be involved in a website decision. And often agencies or external freelancers might be brought in. So they're kind of three clear buckets. So you really got to know those personas and their requirements to then help shape your strategy.
I think one common mistake is not having your persona in order before you set the strategy. Are there any other common mistakes companies making while building a SaaS in a highly crowded market?
Yeah, I think the next piece is if you're trying to protect cash, which many are, there's an inherent tension because you can get things wrong, right? Copywriting is an example. So you can have a junior person in the team write the copy for the website, but actually it's quite a specialist skill, right? And therefore, if they don't have the domain expertise or they don't know the personas, the chances the copy won't resonate. So you miss a trick, you're trying to save cash, but then you're not bringing in expertise when needed. A secondary point is having a clear positioning strategy, right? If you go back, like this is not new, right? Competition has always been here, right? There's a famous American academic, Michael Porter, who wrote in like 1980s. He wrote about Porter's 5 forces, but he also wrote about Porter's generic strategies, right? He was talking about what were the sort of strategies you should use when thinking about market entry, and he talked about focus, and he talked about differentiation, and he talked about being cost leaders, right? So they were the kind of buckets that he was arguing. I think that's the same point. A modern day take on it is someone like April Dunford, who's written a great book called Obviously Awesome, and she's very much espousing the fact that you need to make it easier for buyers to buy. So you got to be able to really articulate how you are different and positioning yourself really clearly so that busy buyers can have a clear sense as to where you're positioned relative to the other choices that they have when they're looking at the consideration set.
Yeah, and I think these two really work together, right? The copywriting and the positioning, because if you have the positioning right, the copywriting can be really related towards your ICPs.
The tricky thing is if you don't have hundreds and thousands of users and customers, it's harder to execute, right? So then in your early years, you might struggle, particularly enterprise applications, you might struggle to get big numbers of customers on. So you have to use proxies whereby you might, in some instances, speak to buyer personas that represent your target group and try and get insights for them, or you're going to give some friendlies essentially free access to your tool in the early months and years so that they're getting to use it, not through having to commercially buy it, but at least they can give you feedback and engage and offer testimonials and social proof and all the good things that you need, which are much easier for maturer companies to get access to, but much trickier in your early days.
Yeah, exactly. It all starts with people using your product, know exactly what you offer. And then from there, you can start reshaping your ICP because it's never set in stone.
And I think the beauty of SaaS is you can use data to inform decisions. So you can look at analytics from product usage to see the areas that people are getting stuck, and it's back to daily active usage and sort of session times. You can get data on how often are people logging into your application and how frequently are they using it. And these are, again, proxies for are they getting value or not from it.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. We talk a bit more high level. You already mentioned check G2, make sure the positioning is right, make sure the copywriting is right. Can you share some strategies or processes you've used to win in a crowded market?
Part of it, another thing is looking at the kind of your hidden powers is the wrong word, but where you think you are disproportionately strong. So again, to use an example for us, right, we could look at content management systems and say, how do we craft a strategy there? So one is you pick a fight, right? So you pick a fight and you start saying X is bad. You don't personalize it, right? But it's a bit like, I think David Cancel from Drift a few years ago started saying forms on website are broken. Why do we still use forms? We should use chatbots. And for me, if I'm picking a fight, I can say, look, WordPress, right? WordPress has a huge amount of advocates for it. But going back to my ideal customer profile and my niche, I want technology companies using our product because I think WordPress is not a great solution for scaling technology companies. So then I can craft content around that and craft a narrative. So I think that's one thing that you do want to be trying to say, what are the push and pull factors? And some of them may be, look, we're really strong with these features, but simultaneously, we can see that the market are having problems with other elements. So picking a fight is definitely a good approach. And then having a clear differentiated strategy, which again is tricky, right? Because often VC-backed startups want markets to be as big as possible. So it seems really counterintuitive to try and pick as narrow a market as you possibly can, but that's the right approach. And you can go broader down the road, but in the early years, you got to go as narrow as you can that's still commercially viable. So in our instance, we can see that WordPress is perfectly fine for a personal website or for a small business that doesn't really create a lot of content and isn't scaling. Whereas we can see for positioning ours that actually it's just not a good fit for scaling technology companies, and therefore they are looking at a whole range of other options. So if we can position ourselves as a credible provider in a vertical that we actually have lots of relationships and contacts and network with, and that's a third point, right? There's three of us that are co-founders. We all come from a B2B SaaS world. So we know that world. It wasn't as if we picked a random category. It was one that we're from. So we've got existing relationships and we've got contacts and we know the ecosystem. So that, again, helps us short circuit the kind of early years around trying to get traction.
Yeah, and I think this is a really important one because if you are going to go really niche, you have to know the market. So if you have three co-founders or three founders who know the market, then it's going to be really helpful because as you mentioned, you know the market, you have relationships, so it's easy for you to get those early users on and to get feedback as much as possible and as quick as possible.
That's it, because like we're all in a busy world, right, where we're all playing a similar strategy in B2B SaaS, right? And one of the strategies is creating content. This podcast is an example of creating content. Another is outbound and using outbound techniques to try and raise awareness. But actually, your kind of ecosystem between the 6 or 7 teammates you may have will have contacts. If they send an email to someone that they know, it's going to get opened. So if you have an overlap with that market, and then the other piece that's kind of linked to that is you can't do this unless you've got a compelling proposition. So, no one's going to do you a favor, but if you say, look, this is worth a look, they're going to take a look because they're known to you. And then the only other thing is if there are switching costs, because often there are a couple of things going on. Either they're using a competitive solution, or maybe they're using Excel or Google Docs equivalent to manage the process. You got to think about how you can switch them because, of course, inertia is a very common problem, right? So you got to take as much of the friction out of the process. So for our instance, we do a free migration for websites. So we're saying, yeah, we could see that would be a source of friction. We'll take it away from you. Now, we won't do it forever, but in our first few years, it makes perfect sense to do it. So again, you're trying to jump the fence, as it were, and think from the buyer's side of the fence, what are the worldview that they have and what are the bits that are going to be troubling them that you can then try and reconcile with your sales process or with your copy.
Yeah, exactly. And the more targeted you are, and as you mentioned a couple of times already, like really get your positioning right, the more easy it is to also say no. Because I think a lot of companies, maybe one mistake they make is to try to sell to everybody at the beginning. But if you can sell no, then this is going to help you as well.
This is it, right? So it's a key points. So again, going back to the WordPress analogy, right? So as that has evolved over 20 years with a very rich plugin ecosystem to try and cater for every need, I find the interface of WordPress pretty unintuitive because they've tried to cater for lots of different reasons and lots of different needs, where by us being really focused on the requirements of powering a B2B SaaS website, we know the world, right? All of my 50 odd clients, they've all had CMSs. I've always gone in and looked at them and obviously had to provide feedback on them. And I've seen the marketing team that are working on them. I can get an understanding of some of the challenges and frustrations that customer profile has. So if we can create a genuinely intuitive UI UX that is easy for marketing people to use, you're straight away tackling a big problem that many of them have with legacy solutions.
Growing a B2B SaaS is tough. We know. This is why we started Reditus. We help you to grow your monthly recurring revenue without high upfront costs. How? By leveraging someone else's network and only giving away a commission when they deliver you a paid client. It's called affiliate marketing. It's already a really cost-effective and scalable revenue channel. We even made it better for you. With Reditus, you can start for free and only start paying us when you generate revenue. Learn more at www.getreditus.com.
Let's talk fun things, challenges, obstacles, maybe mistakes. Can you tell us any, either of these things while building a SaaS in a crowded market?
Yeah, look, again, serendipity and timing is also a factor, right, which people don't want to consider because you can be early to a party or late to a party. So timing is definitely important. There are a few things that I think are worth reflecting on. So we touched on it before the call, actually, you and I briefly. I think it is getting a little bit harder to bootstrap some of these businesses. So I do think if you can bootstrap for a while and get some traction, you're in a much stronger place to go out to market and to raise some finance. So I think that's a good strategy. I think to bootstrap the whole way is getting increasingly difficult. Why? Because you need route to market, you need access to customers, and therefore we can see that certain channels are getting very costly and difficult. Google being one, right? So Google is a key route to market, right, from an organic search point of view and from paid ads, and the paid ads piece is getting very, very expensive. So you do want to have a varied approach, and this is why things like affiliates come in as well, right? So if you can identify similar companies that have similar ideal customer profiles, it makes sense to collaborate, right? And it doesn't have to be a straight affiliate commission type playbook, although that's always useful. You can do things like guest post on each other's blogs to help with the domain authority of the website, but also to give fresh content to audiences that don't have them. So these are some of the things to think about. I guess there's other things that I think are also worth reflecting on in terms of mistakes, right? We're early on the journey. We're hoping we won't make too many, but you do make mistakes when you're a newly founded team, and you got to learn quickly from them. So hiring is challenging at the moment because you're an unknown brand, so you can get hiring wrong quite easily. But the other thing is, there was this old notion that's getting a lot of, push for early stage startups, and it talked about shipping early when you would be embarrassed, right? Which I get, but it's something that I also push back against quite heavily, because I think in some ways, going to an earlier point, if I want to use my network for good effect, I don't really want them clicking around a badly designed application that reflects badly on the founders and doesn't give them any confidence that you're creating a great product. So I think that's one mistake I see, where people take it at face value that because certain VCs in the US are saying ship early and be embarrassed, that you follow it like gospel. Which brings me on to my last point, which is that a lot of the playbooks that we see are US VC-led playbooks, right? And that's a crucial differentiator for us in Europe, because the big difference I see working for US clients versus European is there's just a huge resource gap, right? They raise a lot more money. They tend to have a lot bigger teams. So it's much easier then for them to talk about inbound marketing and talk about all these tools you can use and all these different playbooks. It's a much different scenario in UK and Europe when you got a very small marketing team who are trying to do 50 different things at once and are ridiculously budget constrained. So again, I think the point is the advice and all the content out there, you got to put it through a filter. You can't just take it as gospel, because otherwise you end up doing playbooks that are not a good fit for your playbook, which your playbook has to be shaped by your unique circumstances, and resourcing is a key one. So does that make sense?
That definitely makes sense. I wrote a lot of comments here. I think to start with the last one you mentioned is indeed don't just follow any playbook. Make sure it does fit for you 100%. And I also agree with shipping early can be damaging, because if you are going to be really focused, if you are going to pick a certain niche, indeed, you don't want to burn your network on an app which is not really working or not really doing what it should. Maybe a dilemma, but we haven't shipped too early either, or at least I haven't used my network at the beginning, find some other beta testers before I really started to push things out to my own network.
That's exactly it. And that's a similar approach. I'm adopting the same thing. I have socialized the fact that this is coming soon. For us, it's an enterprise type application, right? It's powering a website. We want to get it right. And therefore, I'm delaying shipping. But this is why you got to reflect on some of this advice, because it's all very context dependent. And I know I think from your notes earlier, it also varies whether you're on 10K MRR or 10 million ARR, right? So the playbook differs greatly whether you're VC backed or you're bootstrapped, and what the stage of your business life cycle is. So again, and junior people can miss this nuance because they probably don't have the experience you and I have that kind of helps shape our view of the world.
Yeah, exactly. Let's talk about Contento for a bit, because as we mentioned already a couple of times, it is in a highly crowded market. How do you see Contento succeed?
Yeah, so what's happened is there's been a new category that has emerged in recent years, right? So it's called headless CMS, which is a technical term, but what it means is there's a separation of the front end and the back end. So instead of having one platform that you log into, the way it was always done with WordPress and some of those other early website builders, it's a complete separation, right? So going back to my point, it's not for everybody, but it's a really fast growing niche. Lots of players that have raised a lot of money, predominantly in the US. So we can see a trend towards that category. So we are in that category, but we notice a couple of things with that category. So for one, there's a lot of focus in the early years on B2C and omni-channel. We're seeing very little focus on B2B, in particular B2B SaaS. So we're saying, okay, all these big brands are consumer brands that are moving across. Why? Because they probably want the security that headless brings. They want the speed. It's a kind of very high performant methodology. And obviously they've got access to their own in-house team of developers to create beautiful websites. So we can see the category emerging. But as I said, it's typically omni-channel and consumer brands that are to the fore at the moment in terms of using those platforms. Second thing is, going back to the personas, I get confused when I land on a lot of these sites because they're very technical. They use language like webhooks and composable architecture and data lakes and whatever else. So they're very much targeting the buyer persona of CTO, right? Which is for those that have a CTO that leads the decision as to your website. But as I alluded to earlier, marketing often plays a big role in deciding on the platform you use. So we're then deliberately trying to appeal for the non-technical users. So our logo has this yin-yang symbol, which would be a traditional Chinese symbol, which is again trying to reflect the fact that we've two distinct personas. And I'm writing a lot of content for our blogs because I'm a non-technical founder. If I read the blogs on many of those that are competing with us in the headless CMS space, I haven't got a clue. I do not know what they mean because they're targeting people that are familiar with the Jamstack and Netlify and React and JavaScript. So they're the basis for differentiation. Now, of course, the other thing is we're making an assumption that our application will be used to power B2B SaaS websites. So that means the others all have this kind of open box whereby you have to go in and try and configure it. Probably the agency that builds it configures. Whereas with us, we make assumptions that the primary use case is for managing websites, which means we can put in certain features for that use case. Whether that's enough to win a viable part of the market, we'll have to wait and see. But that is where we've got to from our initial attempts to carve out a viable niche for us. We'll have to come back at a later date and assess whether that's been successful or not.
Yeah, but you're making assumptions, of course, but you're making educated assumptions because you have the three co-founders coming from the niche already. So I think that's important to say. Like it's almost impossible not to make assumptions.
Right.
And you have to, but at least you're making them on your own knowledge and your own background, which is, I think, really important.
Yeah. Flip side is, so the other co-founders are very technical, so I'm not. So there's a sort of balance there. But we're not arrogant either. We recognize that you can have assumptions, but assumptions need to be validated.
Yeah.
And the truest test of validating is will people subscribe to it. So we're on that journey, but we will look to learn. This early stage phase is tempted to rush to commercialization, right? But you can almost need to treat it as a discovery phase, which is almost like an academic research project, which is difficult, right? So there's a guy in the US called Steve Blank and another guy called Eric Ries, and they talked about the lean startup methodology, where they talked about the early years being almost to validate your assumptions. And I think they're totally right. The problem is you've also got a runway and cash burn, so you're trying to marry both worlds, right? But if you can balance those kind of competing objectives, I think then you're in good shape.
There has to come bread at the table at the end of the month, or VCs have to be happy at the end of the month. So you have to indeed balance them. Is focusing on affiliate marketing, which is like an indirect marketing channel. How do you see indirect marketing helping companies to succeed in a crowded market?
Yeah, look, I think it's going to be a big growth area. I think we're going to face some uncertain years in terms of the mass adoption of AI, and we're already seeing some evidence of that. I think if you've got similar personas and really clear personas, and that you can identify other companies that serve similar customers with kind of complementary solutions, I think it's going to be a real growth area, provided the kind of transaction costs of managing the process are low, right? That there's nothing worse than having a high transaction cost managing any affiliate relationship when the value isn't there. So I think if you can reduce the friction in managing, why then would you not use affiliates a lot more? But I think it's broader than just sticking a product on a catalog page or in an app store. I think you can definitely evolve it into co-creation of content or joint webinars or reciprocal blog links or whatever, so that you're thinking of it more holistically and saying, it's getting harder to create your own audience. Everybody is trying to build audience. We can see the likes of Substack taking off and newsletters taking off. Audiences are shrinking. We talked about intense competition earlier. So the more you can leverage other third parties for mutual benefit, to do it in a sensible way, I think it's going to be a big growth area.
Yeah, and I think we're both the right or the perfect example. We both focus on B2B SaaS companies. So a logical move for us would be after the podcast recording to see how can we help each other, because we're not competitors, but we are focusing on the exact same niche.
And I think, look, like the other thing is startups should help other startups if they can. It's easy for startups to default to the market leader, but we want a rich ecosystem, right? If it can be done in a way where startups help each other, provided, and this is the key point, the product has to be in good shape and deliver real value. We talked about that earlier. Once you tick those boxes and you're comfortable that this is a really good solution, whatever that may be, we know then the likes of your company in mind, that we face challenges acquiring customers at scale. If you can do it in a way that's certainly not salesy, but mutually beneficial, I think it's in everybody's interest to do.
Yeah, exactly. We're coming to the end, and I'd like to ask these two questions at the end. When we talk about succeeding in a crowded market, what kind of advice would you give SaaS founders in different stages? To begin with, somebody who's growing to 10K MRR.
Yeah, so that's obviously an earlier stage company, right? So I'll get back to some of my earlier points that would have been around that you got this inherent tension, because at that stage, you're probably fairly resource constrained. You've got to leverage your network really heavily, but you've also got to realize that you've made some assumptions about the market that you need to validate them, right? Being creative and being resilient are going to be key traits. Similarly, you don't want to be burning cash on paid acquisition at that stage. You're trying to largely do organic acquisition at that phase, because, what you want to avoid is getting a scenario where your cash burn gets too big, because we know developers are expensive. So in the early days, you want your main spend to be on salaries for the few product builders, right? And then only put on the kind of burners in terms of paid acquisition and marketing budget when you feel that the sufficient cash flow is coming in and enough evidence that suggests that there is a market there that your product meets the need of, because you go back to the point, you're making assumptions in the early days, and you almost need to discount the few that are maybe friendlies or so that they're great to have, right? But you don't want to get into this world where you're artificially validating your assumptions. So it's when you start winning new business from people with no contact or no relationship with you, and they onboard successfully and they stick around and they get value from the product. I think then it's a case of going and raising finance if that's the route that you need to do, or trying to get a little bit of a war chest together to go more aggressive in marketing. But you don't want to be trying to scale prematurely. You want to make sure that the signals for further investment or hiring are pretty strong, and that they're not ones that you've misconstrued, which is easy, right? We all want to be successful, right? So we want to be a little bit more conservative about how we read those signals.
Exactly. And you have to be honest with yourself, definitely in this stage, because you can burn the company and burn yourself out and burn your runway pretty quickly.
Exactly.
If we go one stage further, what kind of advice would you give somebody who's growing towards 1 million?
Yeah, look, I think at that stage, you're ramping up your sales and marketing efforts. So you're switching from being more product centric to probably investing a bit more resourcing in sales and marketing. And again, going back to the playbook, you got to try and decide which of those two, even though they complement each other and you ideally would run two of those, but which of those two is the more likely to give you most results, right? So you're probably bulking up your teams at this stage, but you can't fully resource sales and marketing. So it's picking from the early stages, which had you some success with. The other thing is I'd still use freelancers quite a lot. I'm a great believer in freelancers. I think that's still not a big enough kind of journey to say, actually, let's resource up fully across the different functions. So that was one of the kind of raison d'etres for my previous consultancy business, was that those chief marketing officers in Europe were very expensive and they were hard to find. And companies that would have fit into this bucket could have got away with 2 or 3 days a month, having someone like me come in, set strategic direction, set decisions around prioritization, set decisions around resourcing, without needing to put a full-time CMO in situ, and obviously accelerating your cash burn. So there's some of the things I think that are worth thinking about.
Yeah, so I guess here the misconception is often freelancers are more expensive, but in the end they might not be, because you don't need them the full time. You can actually have them certain days, have them do the things you want them to do, and then create a strategy around things.
Exactly right. So before I transitioned into Contento, I had clients at one in Belgium that sort of, to your point, they had 5 or 6 in the marketing function. They were modestly priced, but once I came in like a detective shining my torch around, trying to see where the issues were, it was quickly obvious that they were off track in a couple of serious areas. So I could then, in a very small engagement, a couple of days, provide a lot of value to the CEO to say, look, these are the things you need to fix. And it included analyzing personnel in the team and saying, look, these people are great, let's really work with them, and these people are probably not at the races, and therefore you're probably best moving them on if you can.
Yeah, makes sense. We are coming to the end. Any final thoughts you want to share with other B2B SaaS founders?
I think the kind of point that we touched on earlier, which I think is an important one, is it's a difficult role. There's a club of B2B SaaS founders out there. We're all busy, but we can help other B2B SaaS founders. And it can be as simple as, let's say you want to do a search engine optimization tool. Maybe you don't go with one of the market leaders and you pick someone that's earlier on their journey. The beauty of SaaS, of course, is you can probably buy for a couple of months and then turn it off if it's not fit for purpose. So I guess the message is, give other B2B SaaS founders time, because others won't. And potentially there can be low cost tests that aren't that risky, that mean that you can both benefit from that ecosystem a bit more. So that will be one piece of advice.
Yeah, I really like that, because it's easy to go with the bigger names, but if you can help each other this way, you'll probably get a lot more benefit out of it from it as well. Because you probably get onboarded, probably get a lot more attention than when you go for a bigger company where you talk with account executives or any other kind of roles.
And again, you can do other things to help each other, provided you're happy with the offering. Give them good reviews in G2 Capterra, do testimonials, do whatever, just to help you, because you get your name out on third-party sites, but also you're helping them in the early years get some social proof.
Nice. It's exactly what we're doing right now at Reddit, so it's fun to hear. Final question, if people want to get in contact with you, what would be the best way to do so?
Yeah, so our website is contento.io, and Alan Gleeson is my name. I'm on LinkedIn, so be sure to reach out on either of those channels and say hi.
We're definitely going to add the link so people can find you if they make any spelling mistakes. Thanks again, Alan, for coming onto the show today and sharing all your knowledge.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's been great.
Cheers. Thanks.
You've been listening to Growing a B2B SaaS. Joran has been a head of customer success before founding his own startup. He's experiencing the same journey you are. We hope you've gotten some actionable advice from the show. And we hope you had fun along the way. We know we did. Make sure to like, rate, and review the podcast in the meantime. To find out more and to hook up with us on our social media sites, go to www.getredditus.com. See you next time on Growing a B2B SaaS.